What's up YouTube, this is Dennis Panuta for tutorialsEU. In this video, you are going to learn how to create the UI that you see here, as well as you are going to learn how to use databases in C#. So if you are in any way interested in C# programming and you want to become a C# developer, or you just need that particular knowledge, this video is for you, because we are going to use WPF in order to create the UI, at least the second part of the UI. The first part is what we have built in the other video, in part 1 of this video series. And we are going to basically build all of the database relevant stuff. So you're going to be able to add your own currency rates to all of the currencies that you need. And then you can basically use your currency converter application in order to then convert from one currency to another with the defined rates that you have used and defined. And by the way, please hit that like button. It really helps out this channel, as well as that subscribe button, because we still have a lot of great content that will come up in the next few weeks. So definitely hit that button to not miss out on that great content. All right, so let's get started. All right, let's get started. So what we're going to build in this video is going to be this currency converter that you can see here. And you hopefully have seen part 1, in which we have basically built what you can see here in this tab, which is a basic currency converter. But in video 1, we use static data. And this time we're going to use a database. So we are going to extend the functionality here, and we'll have 2 different tabs. So one tab for the currency converter itself, and then another tab in which we can enter the different exchange rates or the values that are assigned to a specific currency. So here, for example, euro is the base value, and for 100 euros, I get 100 euros, very basic. But then for 100 US dollars, I can get 85 euros. For 100 pounds, I can get 111 euros. Okay, so this is how the database is set up. You can, of course, then later on decide to adjust the database to your liking. You can delete entries from your database with this UI, as well as you can edit entries in the database from this UI directly. And the cool thing is you will learn the fundamentals of databases. You will learn a little more about WPF. And by the way, I highly recommend that you check out video 1, because I'm not going to go into too much detail when it comes to WPF code. So into what happens in XAML, because this is what we have built in the last video, this user interface that you can see here. But as you see, we now have tabs, which is one new thing that we're going to introduce. And then we have this grid here, which is a data grid. And we're going to use this data grid in order to display data from our database. So we're going to set up a SQL database, and then we're going to get the data from the database and put it here. We're going to be able to make adjustments, so editing and deleting and all of the good stuff. All right, so now I have these 3 currencies here, and now I could look into how many euros do I get, for example, for 100 Indian rupees. So Indian rupees in euros, that would be roughly 1.13. So let's just say I get 1 rupee for 100 euros. Let's put it in there. And actually I did make a change to the US dollars because I clicked on that row. But now if I create a new one here, let's create US dollars once again. So the amount was, I think, 88, even though I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter. It's more about the core functionality. And you can see now we have US dollars in there as well. If I now go to the currency converter, I can select of those values that I have in here. So these currency names now appear in my combo box, and I can now select whatever I want. So for example, how many euros do I get for 1,000 rupees? Well, it says 10. Okay, so how many dollars do I get for 1,000 euros? 1,136, even though it's a little more right now. But yeah, currency rates are fluctuating a lot. So you could use this software in order to then go ahead and adjust those settings every single day. And then you would have the daily rates and you could use that currency converter. Of course, this is manual work that is involved in order to do that and to get the current values and the current data. And of course, you would use Google instead of this currency converter. But basically what this allows you to do is to create any type of database software that you want to use. And based on the knowledge that you will gain in this video, you can then go ahead and build your own more complex database using software, and you could go ahead and sell that software. Very good stuff. All right, so either way, I'd say let's get started building this. And as always, at least almost always, with my videos, you can find a complete article with all of the code on my blog. And I'm going to add a link in the description down below. You can find it there, and you can then just follow along the guide in text form if you prefer that. You can find all of the code in there if you don't want to type it manually, and all of the good stuff. So of course we're going to set up a database in this video. So you will need to know how to set up the database. You can follow along here. But of course, I'm going to show you all of that in the video as well. Okay, but still check out the website, and yeah, let's get started. And as I said, I'm going to use the code from the last video that we had used. And if you don't have the code from the last video, well, you can just watch the other video and follow along, because it really makes sense for you to understand WPF. Or you can just copy the code from the website, then you don't have to type it in manually. I'm not going to go into too much detail what's going on here. I'm not going to explain this UI. I'm just going to explain the other UI, which is the second tab that we have here. All right, so I'm going to explain what's going on in this tab, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. Quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# Masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. All right. I will go, however, into detail when it comes to databases, okay? Because this is really the focus of this video. It's not really the WPF, but I think it still makes sense to look into WPF just a little bit. Okay, now enough mumbling and rumbling. Now let's get started with adjusting our UI. So the first thing that we will need to do is we need to have tabs. And in order to add tabs to our UI, to our window, we need to add something called tab control. And where am I going to do that? On the highest level. So this is where the window tag starts. And here, inside of our window tab, we have this grid. Okay, and this grid is basically our whole UI. So in the last video, everything that we had was a bunch of stack panels inside of our grid with 5 rows. Now I want to put this whole screen into one tab. So everything that we had so far should be in one tab. So let me put the whole grid away. So now you can see it's limited to just one line. I clicked on this minus here. And now I'm going to use something called tab control. And I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call this TB main. So tab main. And I'm going to use this property here called tab strip placement. What it does is it allows me to basically say where I want to have the tab. And I want to have the tab at the top because that's where you would expect it on a PC. Usually you have tabs at the top. Okay, so this is going to be the basic tab control. And inside of a tab control, I can have multiple tabs. Okay, and the different tabs that I want to have are tab items. And I can again give them a name. So I'm going to call this one converter. And I'm going to give it a header so that we know what to make with this. So what it is about. So converter is going to be the name of this tab item. So let me now drag this whole grid here. I'm going to paste it all inside of this tab item. Okay, so let me close it. You can see now this whole grid is inside of this tab item called TB converter with the header saying currency converter. So let me start this software just to see if it actually works. And if we now actually have a tab, you can see now we have this new tab called currency converter. Well, that's not the name of it, but that's what it says, and that's what this header is. Okay, so internally the name is TB converter, but what is written here is this header property. Now, a little challenge for you. Create another tab inside of this tab control. So pause the video and try it for yourself. I can really recommend to always try these things directly after you've learned them. Okay, so I'm going to basically create a new tab item. So new tab item, and let's see what would be a good name for this. So tab item would be name, and I call this one TB master. So tab master, and the header will be currency master. Okay, this is where you can create the currencies. And we can start with something very simple. Let's just put a label in there just to see that something is in there, that it works. Okay, so I'm just going to put a label in there with the content of hello world. All right, and now let's save it, or let's refresh. Hot reload. Well, actually it doesn't work for me like that, so I'll need to stop it and start it once again. And now I can go to my currency master. You see the tab exists, and I see that there is this label in there which says hello world. All right, and that is how you can create different tabs very easily. That's how simple it is. And as you saw earlier, we want to create this UI here. So it's very similar to what we had before. We have a box which is red. We also have this pinkish text here at the top. We don't have just one text edit field. We don't have combo boxes here. We have two edit fields, no combo boxes, but we still have two buttons here at the bottom, similar to what we had here. The text of the buttons is slightly different. And then we have no icon here. Well, actually we do have it. Okay, and then we have this grid here at the bottom. Okay, so how do we get that? Well, I'm just going to paste it in from my website because I'm going to go through the code. You could of course try to build up everything manually, because basically you can cheat and you can learn from this. Okay, so I will give you a little bit of an instruction on how to do it. So what you can see here is we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. Okay, so the currency converted text is 1, converted currency including this other text, this is row 2. Then we have this row in which we have this box here, a row in which we have these texts here, and then we have the row with the icon. And now if you compare that to this project here, you can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows again. Okay, the sizes might be a little different, but you will still need 5 rows. Okay, so you will need to do this grid and grid row definitions once again. So let's do that real quick. And I'm going to say, instead of having a label in there, I want to have a grid. So here, grid, and a bunch of grid row definitions. So this way I can define grids in there. Now I have 5 grids, starting with grid 0, or row 0, better said, grid.row 0, grid.row 1, grid.row 2, and so forth. Now the values will differ. So it's 60, 100, then here it's 60, 200, and 150. Okay, so these are going to be the sizes that I want to have. Okay, now the rest I'm just going to copy and paste in and explain every single piece of it. So I'm going to put that underneath the grid row definitions. Okay, so basically you say I want to have a grid type of format inside of this UI, and there are different type of containers. This is just one. Grid is one type of container. There are other ones such as stack panel, which we are using a lot, and this is the whole code here. So we have border, which is basically this border here. Okay, this part here, that's the border that I want to have. And I have a rectangle, which is a rectangle that is inside of this border. So you can very quickly just get rid of this border and then rerun your application, and you will see that I have some errors in there because I'm using elements that I have not put into. So for example, delete button, edit button. Okay, yeah, let's quickly add those before we test the application. So if you paste code in, you always have to be careful, right? Because if you look at it, I'm using this delete button here and I'm using this edit button, which are those two little icons that you can see here. So we need to add them to our project. So these are the icons that I want to use. And by the way, we also have this money PNG. You can use any images that you want. You can just search for images that you like and then use those. And I'm going to drag them into my images folder. Okay, so now one would expect that those errors disappear. Let me do /images edit button, as well as /images /delete button, but the error still is there. And that has to do with this not being fully added to the project. Okay, so a better way or a safe way would be to say existing item, and then you go to images and you select all files, and then you can select the items that you want to have in the project now. I'm just going to say add now, and after I did that, if I save my project, it should find those images. And in my case, well, I had to do it once again individually, so you can also go ahead and go to images, add existing item, and then do it individually so that they are really accepted by your IDE, that they are existing inside of your source. Okay, so this is the source of the image, but we cannot run the application still because we still have some new errors that we created because we are now, or I am now using properties which are dependent on certain events and certain functions that we don't have in our code behind. So you need to make sure that you understand what code behind is, by the way, because I'm here referring to these kind of keywords which I have explained in the first part of this series. So once again, make sure to watch the first part if you don't understand everything that I'm saying as of now. Okay, so we have code behind and we have XAML, and XAML is the UI and code behind is basically the logic behind that code. Okay, and here you can have events which are triggered in certain circumstances. For example, once I click on the save button, something will be executed. In this case, the button save click method will be executed. If you don't have this method yet, you can go ahead and say go to definition, and that will then generate this new method for you. Okay, so just copy the code from the blog if you don't want to type everything in here, but I would really recommend to just copy and paste the code in, because going or doing all of that manually would take forever, and that's why I don't want to bore you with all of that. But basically we are using a bunch of stack panels as we did last time, right? And inside of those stack panels we have buttons, for example those two buttons here, and they have a certain height, they have a certain width, we gave them a name, I have a content for them, which means I gave them the text that appears here for this button. The content says save, then this other content says cancel, so for the other button, which is the button cancel. But then now we have to of course also add a button cancel click event. So let me also go to definition here, and that will then generate a definition for me. And by the way, if it doesn't do that for you, automatically you need to create this method manually. You can also just type it in, it's basic, and you could even give it a different name, and then you can just change the name in here. So whatever name you want to assign there. Okay, foreground is the color of the text, font size is the size of the text, and then we have the style static rounded button round, which is inside of our app.xaml. So I defined it in here with this style property. So if you recall this from the last video, that's how we created this rounded appearance for the button so that it looks rounded. It's not a square button, but it's a rounded button. Okay, and then what else is new? Well, as you see inside of this border, which is, by the way, in grid row 1 this time and not in grid row 2, because on top of that in grid row 0 we have this stack panel. So you can see you can really put the code wherever you want if you work with grid rows, as long as you say at which grid row a specific item should be. In this case, our stack panel should be inside of the grid row 0, and it should say that there's a label, or there should be a label in there, which basically just says currency master, which is this text that you can see here at the top. Okay, so that's the content of it basically. And it's all inside of the stack panel. Then we have a stack panel at row 1, which is at the same position as our border that we created. So this block here, and we have text elements in there, 2 labels, as well as 2 text fields in which we can enter, or text boxes in which we can enter text. Okay, so this is row 1, okay, and this is also row 1. So we have a border with 2 stack panels in row 1. And I say that this stack panel should have 2 labels in it. And if we look at it, it's those 2 labels. So enter amount and currency name. And they are, if we look at it, orientation, horizontal. So they are next to each other. Okay, so they're put next to each other. And then this stack panel here are those 2 text boxes. So text box with the name text amount and text currency name. I gave them a certain width and height, and maybe I should put it more in a more readable way so you can compare the code if you need to. Okay, so what is new is the following. So we have the stack panel with the 2 buttons. That's nothing new, but what is relevant is this number validation box. As you see, we have this preview input text, and we have to do a similar event, and that is further down. We have this selected cells changed, which is inside of our data grid. Okay, so this is something, if we run the application, it will say this method doesn't exist at that point because, well, we haven't created it. You can start the application, but it won't work correctly as of now. Okay, window doesn't contain a definition for DGV currency selected cells changed. Okay, that's because we need to go to definition in order to create such an event. We will implement it later on, but for now we just have it, and we could run the application now, and at least this error shouldn't appear anymore. Okay, and now we can go to the currency master, and you can see now we will actually have all of the appearance, even though there is no functionality. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't work. Okay, but let's look at this data grid in more depth, because that's basically the new thing that we haven't seen in the last video. Okay, so I want to explain the data grid in more depth. We have this data grid, which is basically this whole box here. Okay, this whole thing, and inside of this data grid, we have columns. Okay, so I have data grid columns in there, and you can see we have the data grid text column, then we have a template column, we have another template column, and we have another grid text column. Okay, so these are all of the columns that we have inside of it as of right now. Now, in order to create such a data grid, we can give it a bunch of properties. For example, a height, we can define that. We can define a margin because I want to have some space next to it or on the sides of it. I have a width defined here of 480 pixels. You can set a background, and I just said it should be transparent, so I don't want to have a specific background. Can user add rows is set to false because we want to do it programmatically. Okay. And you have to give it a name if you want to access it programmatically as well. And I called it DGV, which stands for Data Grid View, and I called it currency. So Data Grid View currency is the name that I gave it. And then this property here, or this selected cells changed. That's the interesting part. Okay, so if you search for selected cells changed WPF in the documentation, you will find that occurs when the selected cells collection changes. Okay, so basically we need to use something called binding here to bind the item's source. So what we're going to do is we're going to programmatically change it. Okay, we're not changing it on the UI level, but we're changing it programmatically, and the UI needs to understand that things are changing. So if you look at it here, if you click on one of those cells, this event is triggered. Okay, and for example, if I'm in this row and now I make changes, then it will change this particular row. So let me just go for US. Let's say I clicked on US and now I enter the amount of 86 and the currency name will still be USD. You will see that now USD was overridden. Okay, even though I didn't click on add it here, which would have been the better way, but still it knows which element was selected. And that is something that we can achieve by selected cells changed. Okay, and we can then define what we want to execute in code, so in code behind, when this happens. Okay, then selection unit. So what is selected, and there are different options that we have here: cell or row header, full row, or cell. So I'm just saying, okay, I want the specific cell to be selected, but if you would use full row, then you could, once you click on one cell, select the whole row. Okay, so this is what you achieve with selection unit. Vertical scroll bar visibility, and I set that to auto because I don't want it to be visible all the time. I only want it to be visible if it's necessary. Okay, so you can have different options here. So let's say I use visible here, and let's run the application just to see how this will look like. Go to currency master. You can see this here on the right hand side. The scroll bar is currently available or visible, even though there is no data to be shown and there's no reason for it to be there. So you can use hide or hidden, then it will be always hidden, or you can use auto and it will define it by itself. For it to need to scroll to be able to access all of the data, then it will automatically add a scroll bar, otherwise it will make it hidden. All right, and then we have these different columns. Okay, so we have this column, that column, which have no name as of now. If you look at it, they don't have a name because these are just the icons that we have here. Then we have amount and currency name. Okay, so now we have this data grid text column, and I'm going to use the X name to be ID, the header to be ID. I give it a certain width of 100. Then I set the visibility to hidden, and here I do binding. So I use binding to bind it to path ID. So binding is a little more complex. So this is actually a let's say more advanced functionality of WPF. And what we do here is we bind the ID to this grid column itself. So we say that we want the ID to be assigned to this column, to be bound to the column. Then we have the data grid template column with basically saying that I want to have this image for every single one of those rows in the side of that column. Okay, so it has a width of 70. The header is empty. I don't want to have any text in there. It's read only, set to true, so I cannot edit it. and I set the display index to 0. So basically what I do with this is I say that for every single row that you create, that you add to this grid, I want to have this edit icon to be there. Okay, so I fix it. This is what I do with this data grid template. So a cell template, this cell is going to be always this image. So I'm fixing it. I do the same thing for the next column, where I fix it to be this delete button image. Okay, so for every single row in this column, we have a delete button. Okay, that's what I do with these two data grid template columns. Now, the next ones are not data grid template columns, because we're not using a data template there, but we are actually binding it to a path, which is the amount. And this will make a little more sense once we have the amount and the currency name, because we get those from our code behind, and we need to give this whole data grid an item source, which we will do later on. It's similar to what we have done before, where we had this item source. Let's go all the way up here for our combo boxes, if you recall. Okay, so our combo box from currency, for example, had an item source, and this was defined manually, where we said it was a data table, and we used the default view of that data currency as the item source, so as the data source, so to speak, for our combo box. Now this time we're going to use an actual database to get the data, and we're going to use it as a data source for our data grid, but then we're going to use specific names, column names, so to speak, for that data grid. Okay, so for it to know, okay, in the first row I need to display amount 1 and the currency name, for example, Indian rupees. In row 2 there was euros and the amount of 100. Okay, so these are data grid text columns. Okay, and the internal name of it is amount, and the header, so what is visible, is amount as well. So this header is what is the actual visible value that you can see here. Okay, and then I give it a width of 100, and can user resize is also set to false, even though, well, now you can see this actually works, so I cannot resize it here. And you can see I can even play around with that, and it's always connected, which is very good. Okay, so it gives us a lot of cool functionality. We don't even have to think about it. It's done cleanly by itself. But can user reorder is set to false, so we cannot drag the different rows around. So the reorder is set to false. This binding, as I said, this is the more advanced stuff. This is what we're going to look at later on. And is read only is also set to true, because we cannot change it by, for example, clicking in it and then trying to edit the text. That would otherwise be possible, but we make it read only set to true, because we want to make sure that we're using this clean approach of clicking edit and then changing the values, because otherwise the whole database would be very fragile and we could make it or break it very quickly by just clicking and accidentally typing something in and everything. So that's why we use this is read only set to true. Okay, so these are our data grid text columns, the two. And underneath we have another stack panel, which is basically this image here. So let's go ahead and create a new folder. And as you can see, I cannot do that because my program is running. So let me stop that and go to the Solution Explorer, right click here and add a new folder. And I'm going to call this folder database. And inside of this database, we need to create a new item. So add new item. And here I'm going to use data. So select data here and then service-based database. And then you can give it a name. I'm going to give it the name of currency converter. You could of course call it currency converter data. I'm just going to call it currency converter here. Quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# Masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. Okay, now we have this MDF file, this currency converter MDF file. And once you double click on it, you can see here on the left hand side, the Server Explorer opens up. And you see we have data connections here with tables, even though there are none, views, there are none, functions, and so forth. So basically we only have assemblies here. But what we want to have is tables. So we actually want to have a table. So let's right click on tables and add a new table. So then this new window will come up, dbo.table design, in which you now can design a table. So you can do it directly here at the top. You can say, okay, I want to have multiple columns. And as you can see, the ID column is automatically there. So these are, by the way, your columns. And you can define of what type the columns should be. So you can, as I said, add them manually, but the easier way would be if you do it via code. So here at the bottom, we're using SQL code. So we say create a table, DBO table with an ID, which is of type, or with a column called ID, which is of type int, which cannot be null, and which is our primary key. So what is a primary key? A primary key is something that is unique. So you need to have one primary key in your table, otherwise you would have a complete mess, okay? And the primary key basically allows you to identify every single unique row. For example, if you have a database with 10 million people, okay, then there is a high chance that you will have 2 John Smiths in there. And if they don't have something that makes them unique, then you could mix them up, and suddenly, if you send one of them to jail, well, by accident, you could send a notice to the wrong guy, and the wrong guy would go to jail. Let's say the other guy wins in the lottery, and for example, you send out the notification about him winning the lottery, well, then the wrong John Smith could win the lottery. And that's why you have uniquely identifiable values. For example, the social security number is unique for every single person. But in a database, that would be the ID. So the identification value. And it is the primary key, so to speak, because this one is unique. So every single row has a new ID or different ID. So it starts with 0, then it's 1, then it's 2. So it cannot be that 2 rows have the same ID. They will always have different types of IDs. And that is taken care of by our program, because we say that the ID is our primary key. So it will increment it with every single new entry, and it will give it a new ID automatically. Okay, so I'm going to use this slightly more advanced code, as you can see here. So I'm creating a table which I call currency master. So I'm not going to call this table, I'm just going to call this table currency_master. And I have an ID which is of type int, which is the identifier, which is the identity, and it's not null. Okay, allows null, you can see here, is this column, it's set to false. So it's not possible to make this a null. It has to have a value. Null means it's empty. Okay, so the ID may not be empty. Even though we, for example, don't have an amount entered and a currency name entered, it will already have an ID. Then for the float value, or for the amount, I say that the amount should be of type float, and it can be null. So it can be empty. For the column currency name, I want to use something called nvarchar, which is basically just saying I want to be able to enter a value of up to 50 characters, of up to 50 variable characters. Okay, so there are different types or data types that you can use. You can find integer in here, float, and char, and text. So a bunch of different kinds of data types. If you want to know more about the data types, you can of course check out the documentation on it. You can see that there are a bunch. You could just really enter any of them and read in depth what they are about. So for example, tiny int would be a very small integer with a little size range. So if you want to store very small data, you would, or very small numbers, you would use tiny int, for example. Or if you just want to use a very small text, you could use nvarchar, not 50, but what do we have here? Well, we have max here, for example, but you could use something varchar. Well, as it seems, it doesn't offer me a small one, but there are different options that you have here, okay, when it comes to your data type. So in a database, you could use store something like date, time. You can use decimals, floats, even store full images in here. So there is this data type image in there as well. And yeah, that's basically it. Okay, so we are using nvarchar, which is like a string. You could say this is a string, so I want to store the currency name as a string, okay, or as a text, but it's limited to 50 characters. And then the primary key is clustered, and it is the ID that we're using, which is ASC, which stands for ascending. So with every single new entry, it will increase by 1. So it starts with 1 and it goes up by 1. This is what I defined here. So this is the seed and this is the increment. So I say it should increment by 1 for every single new entry. So the first entry will be 1, the second entry will be 2, the third entry will be 3, and so forth. And by the way, T-SQL is basically SQL code that you can execute here. So this is SQL code. So I'm creating this table, right, with all of these properties. And here at the top hand side, you can see how this table is going to look like. So it basically helps us in a visual way. These are going to be the different columns that you will have in your database. And you can then click update and update the database, and then it will update your database for you. Now, if you look at your Server Explorer and you refresh it now, you will see that now you have your currency master. Okay, your currency master has an ID, an amount, and a currency name. So these are the columns that you now have in your database called currency_master. And now we can access this currency master and we can fill it with data, which is what we wanted. But in order for this to work, we first of all need to make sure that we have a connection string. And therefore, we need to go to our app.config file, and I'm going to add it inside of my configuration underneath my startup. So here I will create a new connection string. So inside of connection strings, I'm going to say I want to have a new connection string. So I'm adding a new connection string with the name of connection string and the connection string property. That is where you need to enter something quite long, and I'm just going to do it real quick and go through what's actually happening here. Okay, so this is my connection string, okay? And my connection string says data source equals local DB, because we are using a database which is installed locally, and it's a Microsoft SQL local database. And the attached database file name is, well, the physical file is equal to, and this is the path where my file is. Okay, so the path goes all the way up to here. So basically in your Solution Explorer, if you go to your database, this MDF file, you want to get its path. So copy full path. And then you can use it and replace your own path with the path that I had here. So in my case, it's under C users Dennis source repos currency converter static. Currency converter static is the name of the project, right? And then inside of that I have once again this folder, currency converter static. Then I have this database folder, and then inside of that database folder I have this file called currency converter MDF, which is this file here. So however you called your file, that's going to be basically or wherever you stored it and however you called it, that's going to be this location that you have here. And then it's integrated and the security is set to true. Okay, so these are the basic settings that I have here. Provider name is SQL Server. In my case, that's set to it. If you want to know more about any of the properties, as I said, always check out the documentation if you want to really understand in depth. But I think if I go in depth about everything, this video will not find an ending. So basically, that is how you can now set up your database. Okay, and it's important that your app config is saved. Your main window XAML is saved as well. Your database is ready. You have made sure that you clicked update, that it is available here in your tables. You can refresh it if you want to make sure that it's really there. But now basically this currency MDF file, and if you look at the properties, you will find the full path here as well. So now you basically have your database set up. It's ready. And you can use it in your code now, which is what we're going to do now. Okay, so now the interesting part comes up. Let's go all the way to the top of our partial class main window, because this is where all of our action is going to happen. All of the magic is going to happen. And I'm going to create a bunch of objects here. So I need to have a SQL connection. Then I need to have a SQL command and a SQL data adapter, because I'm going to need them in order to use with to work with the database and to adjust values inside of that database. Now for this to work, I of course need to make sure that I have the right namespaces added. So show potential fixes, and I need to have using system data, well, SQL client, it's this one here. Once I add that, you can see all of the classes are here. So SQL connection allows me to create a connection to my SQL database, which is this database here, which we created inside of this currency MDF, this table. So this currency MDF is our database, and this currency master is our table. And in order to get access to it, I need to make a connection. Now, in order to run SQL commands on it, I need this CMD, which stands for SQL command. Okay, it's a SQL command object. And then I need the SQL data adapter in order to basically communicate the data in the right format. Okay, DA stands for data adapter. Okay, so you could potentially give it better names than I have here. Con, CMD, and DA are very short names that I used. Maybe not the best practices here, but if you want to give it more complex names, you feel free to do so. Okay, Con, CMD, and DA stands for SQL connection, command, and data adapter. Okay, now we need to have more variables as we're at it, more fields, so to speak. So a private integer currency ID, which I set to 0, from amount, which I set to 0, and to amount, which I also set to 0. So these are going to be fields that I will use throughout the class. That's why I create them here at the top of my main window class, so that I can use them in different methods. So I think they are self-explanatory what they do. And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to establish a function or a method which allows us to connect to our SQL database. So let me create this method for us. So I create this public void myCon. myCon stands for my connection. This is not me conning someone. It's just creating a connection. So I create a string, which I call con. And here, maybe this should be well, I could give this a better name as well, but let's just leave it at that. Configuration manager complains because we need to add this using system configuration namespace. Okay, so I'm going to add that. Now the error disappears. You can see that we now should have this system configuration here. This namespace has been added. All right, and now what I'm doing is I'm using the configuration manager connection string. So 3 times connection string. What the heck is going on here? Well, this is our database connection string. So if we want to connect to a specific database, and we could have multiple databases, right? Well, if we want to connect to one, then we need to make sure that we know which connection string we are using. And in this case, let's go to our app.config, and we gave this connection string to our database that we have here. So to this currency converter, we give it the name connection string. So this name here is now exactly the same name as this name here. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Okay, so now we're connecting to that particular currency converter database, and we do this with our con. So we now basically initialize this con variable, the SQL connection variable, with that connection string that we created. And then we open the connection. So at this point, we open the connection to our SQL connection. So each time we use mycon, we establish a connection to the database, and we can then start running commands on it. We can then start running SQL commands such as putting data into the database, such as getting data outside of the database, or updating data, okay, or deleting data. So it's always those, the crude executions. So create, read, update, delete, crude, okay. If you ever heard that, now you know what they stand for. So create, read, update, delete. All right, now what we need to do is we need to get the data from the database and assign it to our, you see, our combo boxes. So we have this bind currency method, but we will need to make quite some changes to it, because before that, what we used is this data table that we manually filled with data. That's what we did in the last video. And we use that as the item source of our combo box. But now we want to use a database to do the same thing. So we can get rid of all of that code because, well, now we want to use the database instead. And we now, of course, need to give it a data source, so or an item source. Our combo boxes, they don't know what to do now because they have no data. So let's give it some data by, first of all, establishing a connection to our SQL database, and then creating a new data table, then running a command which says select ID currency name from currency master with the current connection. So we are running a SQL command now. We create a new command. We're not actually executing it yet, but we are saying create a new SQL command, which is basically saying create a new SQL execution line. And we say select the ID and the currency name. So select both. I want to have the ID and the currency name from the table called currency master. So where do we have this table called currency master? It's this one here. So if you gave it a different name, you would have to make changes to this particular line. So that's a problem with SQL code. It is very fragile because if there is a mistake in this particular code here, or this string that we have here, then it wouldn't work. So you have to be very careful with this. And on which SQL connection do I want to run this? I want to run it on my con, okay, on this SQL connection that we have opened up by running my con. Okay, so we initialized it and now we can use it. So now we have this command and we need to define the command type. So we want to use this command type.text. So you can check out, there are different command types here. You can see stored procedure, table, direct, or text. And we're just going to use simple text. We make it simple. And now what we can do is we can use this DA, which is our SQL data adapter, in order to actually establish a connection and execute something. Okay, so basically I'm going to say create a SQL adapter with that command that we prepared and assign it to our data adapter. And now we can use this fill method, and it adds or refreshes rows in a specific range in the data set to match those in the data source using the data table name. Okay, that's what this fill method does. So basically we're using the data table here, and we fill the data table. So this object that we created out of this data table, which is a C# object, it's not a data, it's not a database, but it's really just a table, but in a format that C# understands well. Okay, so we say, okay, this data table, it should be filled with the data that we get from this command, the cmd command, which internally runs this command line here, which is connected to this SQLite connection. So this is how everything is connected. So this is basically always the setup that you have to do. You have to establish a SQL connection, you have to run a SQL command, and then you can execute or create a SQL data adapter with that command, and you can fill your data object, your data table object, C# object, so to speak, with that newly created data adapter, and that's how everything is connected. Okay, and now at that point we can get the individual rows. Okay, so we get the first row, and how do we get a row? We get it from our DT, which is now filled. So this data table was filled in this line, and now we can create a new row out of that data table. So we get the data from the data table, and we can change the data in that data table as well. So by creating a new row, I'm saying add a new row to that data table. Okay, and new row should have an ID. So I'm assigning an ID to it, and I'm assigning into the currency name column, I add select. Okay, so if we look at it again here, this is this select here. So I'm saying at the first position, there should always be select. And then the other ones, they should be manually created in the currency master. Okay, so I will now insert that row. So here, basically I created a new row, and now I add that to my data table, our DT data table, where I say rows, insert a new row, and insert that new row at position 0. So at your very first entry, your first row, so to speak. And now next thing is we can check if that worked. So we check, is data table not null, and is data table rows.count greater than 0? If that's the case, now we can use our combo box from currency item source and define DT as the item source. So the default view, which is basically just a format that our combo box understands, okay, because combo boxes are limited in their brain capacity, so to speak. We say we give you the default view, which gets a customized view of the table that may include a filtered view or cursor position. So basically we say use the select here. Okay, and if there is more data in it, well, even better. But for now, this is going to be fine. We just say add select or display the select part in there. And then for the combo box to currency, we also say that the item source should be DT default view. So after that, we can close the database or the connection to our SQL database. It's not the database is closed, but the connection to it is closed. And now we can get rid of this line here because we did it in there, and we can get rid of this line here because we did it in here. And yeah, that's basically it for now. Even though maybe we should change the names here. So combo from currency should be maybe currency name. The same goes for this one here, and it shouldn't be value, but it should be ID and ID, because this is what we used before, right? We called it text and value before, but now we called it currency and ID, or currency name and ID. Where do I have it from? Well, from my database, because I have here currency name. This is the name of the column, and ID, which is the other name of the column. So I need to make sure that I'm actually getting them from the right column, so to speak, because if you look at it, now our combo box from currency gets all of this data from the database, or from this data table, which gets it from the database. Okay, so we get this data table here, and we assign it as item source for our combo box. Quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# Masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. All right, and now at this point, there's a jump. We need to make sure that we can click that save button. So I ran the application, it still works, which is great. But if we look at it, of course, the currency master doesn't do anything. So if we click save or cancel, nothing will happen because, well, we haven't implemented the functionality yet. So if you go to your main window.xaml, you will see that you have this stack panel with the buttons, right? So inside of your second tab, which is the tab item TB master, okay? So inside of that, let me go here. We can see we have all of these stack panels and text boxes and all of the good stuff. And now this is where we have the buttons now, okay? So we have this button, click save and cancel. So let's go to button save click and go to the definition. And you will see that you have this button here, button functionality, which will be executed once you click on the button. But as you see, there's nothing happening yet. And now I'm going to use a try and catch block because I'm working with databases. And when I'm working with databases, something could go wrong, whatever it is. The connection could break or whatever. It's weird, okay? And to make sure that we don't run into a colossal break of our application, I'm going to use a try and catch block. And regarding the exception, I'm just going to catch a generic exception here. So I'm just going to say exception X should be executed, and I'm just going to run a little message box here saying what kind of error appeared. So message box show error, message box gives us the button OK, and the box image should be error. So now if we click on save and something goes wrong, then this little message box will appear, which is just a little pop-up box. All right. So what is it that we want to try when we click on that save button? Well, there is a bunch of stuff happening. So let me first of all check if the text amount is not empty. So because if we look at it here, the entered amount for both of them should not be empty. So that's what I'm checking here. So if text amount is not null and is not empty, then we can move on. But if it is empty, we will say please enter amount, and we'll say OK and message box information. But that will be the message box image, okay? And we will focus on text amount, so on this window here. Let me actually run this so you can see that in action. Let me go to the master, I click save. You can see this is the message box that appears. This is the information image. So if we look at it, information is the text that appears at the top of this box. So this is information. You can see please enter amount is the first entry that you give, the string here. The message button is this OK button, which is this message button OK that I have here. And then the message box information is this icon that we have here. Okay, so I have these two if statements which check did we enter values or didn't we? And if we didn't, we need to enter something. So first we check if the text amount is empty. If it's not, then we check is the currency amount empty. If it's not, that's when we do the logic of saving the data. Okay, so this is the else block that we are going to check. All right, so let me put a bunch of code in here, and let me actually stop the application running, otherwise it's a little confusing. Okay, so what do we do here? First of all, we check, is the currency ID greater than 0? Because if it's 0, well, then we are trying to edit this select here. Okay, because we don't want to edit select, we only want to edit anything else that is in there. So that's what we check, is currency ID greater than 0? And then we just say, are you sure you want to update? Yes, no. So the user has two options. The message box image is a question, and we take the message box result. So we see what has the user clicked. So you can see this whole thing here, this whole message box execution is inside of an if block. So what we say is, if the user clicked on yes, so the window pops up and he can select yes or no. If he says no, then this if statement will not be executed and we jump out of this whole iteration. Okay, so we basically jump out of any of the save functionality, so we will not save anything. But if it is true, so if the user clicked on yes, that's when we are going to try to actually make changes to our database. So first of all, we need to establish a connection to our SQLite database. And that is this mycon, which is the SQL connection that we establish. So it's this method here where we get the connection via the connection string. If you recall, we open a connection to the SQLite database and then we start with the magic. And that is here. Okay, then we create a data table because, well, we need an object to put the data in. Then we run a command. So we say that the CMD, the SQL command, should be a new SQL command. So this is another SQL code. This whole line here, this part here, this is SQL code. All right, and let me put that into another line here so it's a little more readable. So this is SQL code, and what it says is, please update the currency master table. What is the currency master table? Well, it's this table here that we have. So please update that and set the amount to be at amount and set the currency to be at currency name, where the ID is at ID. So what is all of this at stuff? Where do we get that from? Well, that's what comes up in the next few lines. But basically, this is the line to update something in the database, and we are updating the row which has the specific ID. And what are we updating? Well, the different columns. So the column amount and currency name. And we do that with the connection. So this is the SQL command line. So what kind of command type is it? It's text. So this is text, right? This is a string that we're using here. So we are using the command type text. Okay, then what we say is we add values to it. So we say we need to add parameters to this command because we are using parameters here. This is a parameter that we use in this SQL command, and we need to give it a value. So we say add with value, and we say add ID should be our currency ID. So what is our currency ID? Well, if you look at it here at the very top, we created this variable called private int currency ID, which is the ID of the currency inside of our database. Okay, then we want to update the amount, as you see here, with at amount. Where do we get the amount from? From our text amount.text. What is text amount? Well, you can press Control and click on text amount, and you will see that it's this text box here, this one here, with the name text amount. So basically it's this one here. This is the text amount. So whatever we have entered in here should now be our amount. So this at amount here. And then we have text currency name. You can again keep control clicked, click on it or held, and then you can see this is the text box that is called text currency name. Okay, so now we are updating it with whatever we have entered into those two boxes. And where are we updating it in the table? Well, wherever we currently are. So whatever the current currency ID is. Okay, and then we execute this non-query. So executes a transact SQL statement against the connection and returns the number of rows affected. So you could get the value, so this will return an integer and it will say how many rows were affected. But we're not really interested in that. We just want to make sure that the execution is really done. And then we say connection close. So each time that you open a connection, after you finished the execution with that connection, you need to close the connection again. And that's what we do. So here we open the connection with myCon because this method opens the connection. And here we close the connection once again, just to make sure that there are no leakages and we don't run into new errors that could appear. And once all of that is done, so once it did all of the execution and all of that, and by the way, this is the part where it could run into an error. That's why we are using a try and catch block. Then we display a message box saying data updated successfully. And we inform the user, we have this OK button, and the image that we're using is the information image. Okay, so that is our code that we want to execute there. Once we click on the save button. So this is when the currency ID is greater 0. If the currency ID is not greater 0, we want to make sure that we are adding a new line. So this is what happens here. So this is where we're actually creating a new line. And we're saying, open a new connection. And by the way, of course, first of all, we ask the user, does he really want to save it or not? And if he says yes, then we execute this code. So we say, open a connection, establish a new command, a SQL command, and this is our SQL code once again, and we need to run it on a SQL connection. And we say insert into currency master the amount and currency name with the values of amount and currency name. So this here is a SQL command. So if you don't know any SQL, I would recommend to check out SQL basics. But basically, if you want to update something, well, you use this update keyword in capital letters, and you run this line here. This where clause, by the way, says at a specific position or where a specific condition is met. And in this case, where the ID is the ID that we have used. And here we say we want to insert something. So we don't have a where clause, but what we do is we insert something into something. Where do we insert it to? To our currency master. What is currency master? Well, it's our database here. So the database was, or this table to be more precise, the table is called currency master. The database had a different name, but this is the name of the table. So insert into this table at the columns amount and the column currency name, the values of amount and currency name. So you use the brackets here because we are entering multiple values. If you wanted to enter, or not multiple values, but we are entering multiple columns into multiple columns. If you had 3 columns, for example, so let's say you had another column called, what would it be? Currency name and country code. Okay, for example, then you would have something like a comma and a third column name that you want to use. But we only have 2 column names that are relevant for us. That's amount and currency name. So we assign values of amount and currency name again. And we use this add keyword again because we are adding parameters later on again. So you see, we are adding a new parameter with the value at amount. Where do we get the amount from? Well, from our text amount, which is this text field, and from our text currency name, which is this text field, which is a text box to be precise. That's the name, at least, that they decided to use in WPF or in XAML. Okay, and then we execute that non-query and we close the connection. So we do the same approach as we did here with the minor change or difference that we're not updating a value, but we're actually inserting into it. And that is why we use this currency ID greater 0, because we, at position 0, what we do is we basically just have this select, right? So if we go to currency convert, we have this select here. But at position 1 now, we would now insert something. And then the next time we want to save something again, after we made changes to it, for example, by editing it, well, then we would go ahead and update it, okay? Then we would do the updating part. But here we're actually adding something to the database. And then I'm using clear master. What is clear master? Well, clear master is basically a function which allows us to clear everything. So let me just add that here as well real quick. It's not very complicated. So this method is used to clear all the input which the user entered in the currency master tab. Okay, so we reset text amount to be empty, text currency name to be empty. We set the button save content to save, because later on we will see how we can change it to be called update. So basically we say that this button here should have the content of save again, because once we click on this edit button, let me show you. So I click on edit, you can see now it says update. It's not saying save, it's saying update, but we are putting it back to save. And then we call this method get data. So we still need to implement get data. We set the currency ID back to 0 because, well, we are clearing everything. We bind the currency. So what was bind currency? It's this method here where we get the data table. So we basically assign the data table correctly and we display the data. And then we set the focus on text amount. So we set the focus to this enter amount again. And in case something goes wrong, we just show this message box saying error, and the user can press the OK button. These are the best kind of errors. All right. So now we need to get this get data method. So what is this get data method? Well, because the thing is, we're not really, at this point, we're not really filling any of this information in here, or we're not displaying any of the information. So in get data, which is a new function that we need to create, or a new method, let me quickly add that here. We bind the data in the grid view, data grid view, because if you look at it, this thing here, this big thing here, this is our data grid view, and I need to make sure that something is displayed there. And that's what we do with this get data function. So in order to display anything in the data grid, we of course need to get the data. And how do we get the data from a database? Well, first of all, we establish a SQL connection to it with our function mycon, which we created. Then we create a data table so that we can bring it into a format that C# understands it. Then we have this command, the SQL command, which basically says select star from currency master. So what does it do actually? Well, it selects everything. Star means everything. So select means give me everything, or give me, in this case, everything. From where? From this table called currency master. Okay, so we have this table called currency master, and in that table we have all of the data. And now I want to get all of the data with this one line of code. And the command type is again text. Then I need to establish a SQL data adapter. I need to fill our DT, and this is what this data adapter is even for, right? An adapter, as you might know, it converts from one to another, from one thing to another thing. That's exactly what we do. We convert whatever we get in SQL format, we convert it into a data table, which is C# format, which our program understands and which we then can display. Because basically what we're doing is we have the data in a SQL format, we convert it into a data format which C# understands, and then we give it to XAML, which understands how to display stuff. Okay, so we have a bunch of adapters in between there, even though we don't see all of them. But the SQL adapter, that's the one that we need to do manually. Okay, and then we fill the data table with whatever we have from our SQL adapter, and then we check, is it not empty or is it at least greater than 0? If that's the case, then set the data grid view currency item source to be the default view of it. Otherwise, make the item source null, so make it empty, and close the connection. Okay, so what is this DGV currency? Well, it's this data grid view, this whole thing. And we say if there is something to display, then set the item source, so the data source, so to speak, to be whatever we have in our data table that we just created. So this data table, which we fill with data from the database via those 4 lines. And then we check, is there data in this data table? If there is data in the data table, then make sure that you display this data table in the data grid view. And if there's no data, then make sure to make the data grid view empty. So say that the item source should be null, so empty. And then close the connection, because as I said, if you open a connection, you need to make sure that you close the connection. Because if you don't close it and you open up another one, then you might run into new problems. All right, and at this point, we should be able to run this application and put data into the database. So enter amount and click save. Are you sure you want to save? Data saved, and you see it's there. Okay, and now we have what we wanted. We have the capability of adding data to a database and displaying it in a data grid view, which is what we have here. Okay, so now you know how to add data to a database, you know how to get the data from a database, and now what we want to have is the option to edit data from a database. So let me just try that. Let me save it. You see, I didn't update it because none of those buttons actually work. We still need to give them functionality, but you can see I can add values in here, which is very bad. Now I have 2 DEs. Which one is it now? That's very confusing. And now I definitely need the capability of editing or deleting something. So let's now first of all test if our currency converter is still going to work. So I'm going to just add random values here. Okay, so this one will be USD. Let's save it. And this one will be fluorine, even though fluorine don't exist anymore. Okay, so let's just make the comparison here. 111, and we use USD and fluorine. You can see they appear here. Why do they appear here? Well, because we set the item source of those boxes to be the data that we have in the data table, which is amazing. And now we can convert, and you can see it actually works. So now our tool fully works already, but of course it's not as convenient as we would like it to be. We cannot add it and we cannot delete, and that's what we're going to cover now. And by the way, if you made it this far, then definitely hit the like button, please, because I put a lot of work into this. When I built this video, I even thought, man, this could be a complete course that I could sell, and now I'm offering it on YouTube. And I'm like, oh man, this is so much time that I'm investing into this. So if you appreciate the time and effort I put into this, then please hit that like button and also subscribe. And if you want to know more about databases and C# and WPF and game development, for example, definitely consider buying my Complete C# Masterclass. You can find the link in the description below. Okay, so we're over an hour in, 1 hour 20 or something into this video. So now let's go ahead and add the functionality to actually do editing and to do selection change and cells change and all of the good stuff. First of all, though, let's add functionality for the cancel button, because if we look at it, we have this cancel button and it doesn't do anything yet. So let me quickly add that. So this button cancel, it's very simple, and I need to stop the execution of the program for all of those green lines to disappear. So we have button cancel click. well, a basic click event, right? With the root event args and an object sender. So we try to clear the master, which means we use this method that we have here, where we reset everything and we get the data. So we don't delete the data from the database, but we're just clearing the text fields. And we make sure that the button save content button is back to safe. And if an error occurs, we just display a message box to the user so he knows, okay, there's something wrong. Okay, so now that that is out of the way, let's take care of those methods that we have not implemented. So now I have 2 button clicks, or button cancel clicks. Let's get rid of those. So we need to implement this DVG currency selected cells changed. Okay, and what I want to execute in here, this is going to be a little more code. So let me paste it in here and talk about it. So we have this event that will be triggered once we clicked on one of those cells. Okay, once we change the cell, so to speak. And what we are going to try, because things could go wrong, we first of all create a data grid. And what do we create it from? Well, we create it from the sender. So you can see the object sender. Object is very convenient because in C# everything is an object. But what we are trying to do is we're trying to make an object of type data grid out of the sender. And as we are in an event method, the selected cells changed method, that will be executed once we click on those on the data grid itself. So on this here, the sender will be in fact a data grid. It will be specifically the grid that we are working with. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and create a data row view out of the row that was selected. We're going to call this row selected, and it will be the GRD, which is our data grid, dot current item. So the current item itself might not be of type data row view. It will be of type object, which everything is an object, right? But we want it to be a data row view because then we can use row selected in certain ways, okay? Because now we can get the column name of it and all of the good stuff. Okay, so now we know which row we selected. And if the row selected is not null, which means we have a row that was selected, because that's basically what we get from here. We get the row, and if it wasn't empty, we check if the DVG or DGV, or so data grid view currency items count is greater than 0. So we have some items inside of our data grid. So here there are items in here. If there are none, then this wouldn't work. But as there are some, we get into this if statement and this code will be executed. So then we check if the selected cell is greater than 0, which means we have selected one. So these if statements are just to make sure that everything is clean, that we actually have something, that we have an object that we can use and so forth. That's just to make sure that we don't run into errors straight away. And then we get the currency ID. And where do we get it from? Well, we parse it from the selected row that we have selected, and we get its ID, and we make a string out of it. So this gives us the ID of the selected row. So for example, this here, this is a cell in the row, which is at the very top here, for example, but internally it could have an ID of 3 or 4 or whatever, because if you change it here, you see suddenly this row is at the bottom. So which one is the ID 1 now, or ID 0, because we don't display the ID in our UI. So I'm getting the ID now with this approach, and then I check if the selected cells at position 0 at the column of it is the display index of 0. So then it means that it is the edit cell. So if we selected the edit cell, so if we clicked on the edit cell, then we want to execute some code. What do we want to execute? Well, we want to execute the following code. So we're saying that the row selected amount to string should be the text amount.text. So what does that mean? Once I click on this thing here, you can see that this text is edited. Okay, now it says 111 once I click on it. And once I click on it, this currency name here, this text field, this text box is also populated. And that has to do with this line here, where it says text currency name dot text row selected currency name to string. So we're taking from the row that we selected the currency name, which we get from the data table, or actually the grid itself. And because the grid, well, we get the row from the grid, and the grid has the data from the database. So we're not specifically getting it from the database, but we're getting it from the grid itself, from the row of the grid. And now we can populate our text fields or text boxes with that. So we say the text should be whatever we get from the data grid. And we make sure that the button save button content is set to update. You can see now it's update. If I click cancel, it's back to save. Once I click on this button here, you see it goes back to update. And that's what this code here does. And then in the next if statement, so both of them can be executed. This is not an else if. Then we check, is the column display index 1? Even though we could, of course, do an else if. Well, it's fine. So if it's 1, then we know that the lead cell was clicked on. So then we know that this button was clicked on, because this is the column 1. This is the column 0. This is column 1. This is column 2, column 3. Okay. So we know that the display index of that column is 1. Then it's the delete button. So then we can just ask the user if he really wants to delete whatever he clicked on. And if he says yes, which is this if statement here, we say, let me put that into a different line or in 2 lines, then you can see it better. So we see, did the user press yes? If he did press yes, establish a connection to your SQLite, then create a data table, execute a command, then do the command type text, so execute the text, and then do the command parameters here, and set the, well, add the value with the ID, with the currency ID, and then execute that value. So basically we're saying delete it from our currency master table, which is this one here. So delete it where the ID is the ID that we have currently selected, which is the currency ID. Where do we get it from? Well, it's the one that we have currently selected, from the row that we have selected. So here we're saying, please delete the row that we have selected from the database. And then we use this message box to show deleting was successful. And then we use clear master. What does clear master do once again? Well, if you recall, it says, or it calls this get data and bind currency, which basically resets everything and displays the data in the right format. So basically after deleting, you want to make sure that the deleted row doesn't appear in your data grid anymore, because otherwise you might be confused because you think, okay, I have deleted it, but why is it still there? And that's why you need to make sure that you also update the UI after you have updated your database, because otherwise they are not in sync with each other, and this could cause all sorts of problems. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, we clear the master, and well, if an error occurs, we just display that there is an error. We say what the message is, and we say it's an error, and that's it. So now at this point, we should be able to delete rows. Let's see. Let's go to the currency master, and you can see that nothing is in here. Let me test it. So 1 test. Let's add that. Okay, so you see that we are not displaying the data grid at the beginning. This is great. A little test for you. How can you make sure that the data grid is loaded at the beginning when this application is loaded? Okay, because before I go any further, I want to make sure that we do that. So you can pause the video and try it yourself. So basically, in the main window, once we are establishing the execution here, once we start running the app, and let me stop running the app, we want to make sure that we run bind currency as well as get data. So this will now get us the data, and we'll bind the kind of currency. And now if we run it and we go to currency master, you can see all of them are there. So now they are there. Now it works. Now let me delete this one. Yes, test was not successful. Let me edit this one. And as you see, edit doesn't do anything because we didn't actually implement any functionality for edit yet, except for, of course, that we need to edit here. So yes, we can edit it. It's there. So let me use a different one here. OMG is the new currency name. Let me update that. And data was successfully updated, and you can see the data is in fact updated and it's here. Quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# Masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. And at that point, well, I'd say we're done with this application, at least with this version of the application. You've seen how you can use databases in C#, how to use WPF to create a user interface such as this one, and to put data into the database or store it in the database, how to update database entries, how to delete them, how to create new ones, well, the whole CRUD operations, how to read the data, of course, as well, because that's what we do when we display the data. So you saw all of the CRUD operations, you know how to do them now. If you want to know it in super much depth, then I would definitely recommend to check out Sql Basics, so a complete Sql course maybe even. And if you want to know more about WPF or C# or databases in general, you can of course also check out my Complete C# Masterclass, because there I go into a lot more depth with all of those topics. I explain what binding is, what routing is, because, well, actually I didn't even explain it fully yet, but let's see where we had binding, because you see here we are binding directly to the amount. So the data grid text column that we had here, which is this one here, this amount, it is bound to the path of amount. So it gets the amount that we have defined. And the same goes for the currency. So we bound it. But if you want to know a lot about binding or about routing and binding and the depth of how events work and how buttons are actually working in the background and all of that, definitely check out my Complete C# Masterclass. And as I am working on the WPF Masterclass, you might also want to check that one out once it's released. But at this point, I would recommend that you play around with this application as you like. And by the way, if you were wondering why I have this beautiful little icon here, as you can see, it's even here at the bottom, and I don't have it in the version that we created, well, you can very easily achieve this yourself by having an image and then adding one line to your whole application. And let me show you, it's not even a line, it's just a very little bit of code. It's this one here, icon images money. And actually in my case, it's /images/money.png, which if we look at the Solution Explorer is this money PNG file. Okay, it's this one here. So if I rerun it, then it should now have this beautiful little icon, and there we are. So now you see it's there, and this is your currency converter. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, as I said, please leave a like. As I said as well, a bunch of work went into this, not just myself, but also my team to prepare the code for me and everything. So I hope to see you in the next video, and I hope you have a nice day and learned quite something. And because that's basically the goal of all of these videos, right? That you learned something. And if you have any ideas for future videos, then please let me know. And by the way, there is a third version of this video, and I'm still considering if I want to put it on YouTube, because I think I will just put it in my Complete C# Masterclass as exclusive content, because there I will show you how to use an API to get the currencies. So you don't need to actually put them into a database, but you get it from a currency database online, which is an API, or which allows us to use its API to get the data and to use it directly. All right, so I hope to see you in the next video. All right, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the video and you learned something new, and you can now use it for your own programs and your own job and everything. And if you like the video, then please hit that like button as well as the subscribe button. And also consider getting my Complete C Masterclass, in which you will also get part 3 of this series, where the data comes from an API. So it's downloaded from an extra API which offers the latest conversion rates. So the application will always give you the correct currency conversion for that moment when you do the currency conversion, rather than relying on you entering new data every day, or even worse, having the data only available in a variable inside of your program's code, basically. Okay, so if you like this video, then definitely consider getting my C# Masterclass, in which you're going to learn significantly more than you have learned so far already. And yeah, I hope to see you there. And if not, then definitely check out one of the other videos on my channel. So have a nice day and see you in the next one.